Okay, thank you so much. This will be a lively presentation for me anyway, as my computer crashed and I lost the presentation. But that's great news because it forces me to be really alive and present with you all. And for the images that were lost for right now, I will rebuild the presentation and that will be available on the Beck website as a PDF. You will also see a lot of the images in the tours later in the conference. So I want to start the talk today by asking if any of you have experienced a true oasis. Now, what do I mean by that? A true oasis, that is a very verdant location, opportunity that is thriving just on the natural resources at hand. It is not reliant in any way on imported or extracted resources. There's no pump house behind a screen. There's no electrical cord powering the pump to keep the thing going. Rather, it's just thriving on what is, and it's generating ever more potential. So I want you guys to be thinking about that. Have you experienced that? And if you have, what was it like for you? And while you're thinking of that, I want you also to ask yourself, what did it enable? And did you have a role in that oasis? So as you're thinking about that, I want to share one of my favorite oases with you. So this is Check Dam Canyon in the Tucson Mountains on the west side of Tucson. This is a very dry mountain range. It's known more for its cacti, dry vegetation, and rocky soil. But thanks to work done in the 1930s by the Civil Conservation Corps, there is one canyon full of check dams, which are these low rock walls put across the drainage. And they've so slowed the flow of water that they've allowed a lot of nutrients, soil, and whatnot to accumulate behind. And it creates a sand tank that rapidly absorbs the water and then slowly releases it. So in a mountain range where you have no surface water, in this canyon you have springs and you have ephemeral creeks. So thanks to this simple intervention that slows down, spreads out, and infiltrates more of the flow. So the amazing thing about these springs here, they did not exist before this work was done. And all this did was it slowed the flow of the water out of the system and allowed it to be available and cycled more times. So not only do we have these springs, but there's monkey flower, there's all kinds of abundant insect and bird life, and a much greater diversity of vegetation. So I love going to this place knowing that it's not degrading any other place, but rather it's enhancing the potential of this place. And the other reason why I love it is those springs and all were generated simply by recognizing and managing our free on-site water, the rain, in a way that can enable that spring to emerge. So here in Tucson, we are particularly lucky because we're in the Sonoran Desert, and the Sonoran Desert has two rainy seasons rather than just the one rainy season of the Mojave or Chihuahuan deserts. But even in those drier deserts, as is the case here, there is a huge abundance of native food-bearing vegetation. So here in the Sonoran Desert, there's over 450 native food-bearing plants. And these are just a few. And the great thing about these plants is they don't just survive, but they thrive and produce solely on local water, the rainwater. So this is a great way to grow food without having to rely on extracted or imported water from elsewhere. And it's thanks to this diversity of native vegetation, the blessing of two rains, and the ingenuity of our human species, that Tucson is perhaps the oldest continuously cultivated place in what is now the continental United States. So for over 4,000 years, this place has been continuously farmed, despite the fact that it's a very dry climate with just 11 inches of annual rainfall. So up until about 100 years ago, we did have the Santa Cruz River, which flowed year-round. And our water table was much higher, much more easy to access with a shallow dug well. But due to overconsumption of the groundwater and mismanagement of the watershed, we've lost that. But before we lost it, the Santa Cruz River floodplain was the breadbasket of Tucson. And gravity-fed canals would divert the water from the Santa Cruz throughout the floodplain. In a way, doing much the same thing that check dam did, I showed you in a previous slide. It's what these gravity-fed irrigation canals did is they spread the runoff flow of the Santa Cruz River throughout more of its floodplain, where the water infiltrated and then would slowly make its way back to the river, and it would continue on. And a number of studies in the Rio Grande River watershed have found that the traditional acequias, irrigation ditches, actually enhance the flow of the Santa Cruz River rather than deplete it. Because what they do is they capture and distribute the surging runoff flows from the winter snowmelt, and they bank that into the soil, and the water slowly migrates through the soil back to the river. So you don't get the spike flood flows, but you get longer, more consistent flow throughout the year. Unfortunately, on the depressing side, our ever-increasing pumps and whatnot are decreasing the flow of the rivers. But I don't want to focus just on the river, because that's where we tend to go. But I also want to focus up in the upper part of the watershed. So when you guys get out of the conference and you look to the west, you'll see a mountain with a big A on it, and a taller mountain beside that. That's Tumamoc Hill here. And all at the base of Tumamoc Hill are these trincheras, these prehistoric terraces that slowed down the runoff from the uplands, infiltrated it, much like the check dam, and banked the moisture in the soil to grow not only the perennial native vegetation, but domesticated crops. So all of that, I feel, is an oasis. But when I come into Tucson, and when I start to realize what supports Tucson in our modern day, I start to think, this place that once was an oasis feels now to me more like a mirage. And especially when I see how we build in this fashion, where we direct all the roof runoff and the rain hitting the landscape off the property into the street, and then the infrastructure, in this case much like the guns of Navarone, shoots the water out of the system. And this creates flooding liabilities downstream that didn't exist before this drainage infrastructure. So we've basically created much of our built infrastructure in the modern day to act like a drain. And in my opinion, when we have drainage infrastructure, we live in a mirage, because it is not built on a foundation of reality or resilience. So what I am striving for is more the net, the sponge. How can we create our built infrastructure, renovate our built infrastructure, and maintain it in a way that doesn't drain our most valuable resources, particularly in the dry land environment, our rain, but rather captures it, enhances it, enables it to do more. So this then shifts us into the realm of green infrastructure, because I see this as one of the ways that we can shift our drainage gray infrastructure into a more alive green infrastructure. So what is green infrastructure? So I see green infrastructure as living infrastructure. And I really want to emphasize that, because without the living element, it's not going to meet its potential. And I think this living element, this can be a wonderful gauge to see, are we doing well or not? If we're becoming more dependent on built systems and less dependent on living systems, we're becoming ever more reliant on ourselves to do the maintenance. Okay? Whereas if we rely more on a natural system, it can do more of the maintenance. It can enhance the potential. So living systems of vegetation, soil life, and infiltrated stormwaters are key to its function and effectiveness. It strives to align design principles and ecological systems understanding. Thus, it works and demonstrates natural processes within our built environment. Okay, so a piece I want to capture there is all too often when I walk through a city, it's full of life, there's the people and all of that, but beyond the people, I seldom have any daily contact with what enables this city to be. So if you think about it, just about every city, every town, every community that exists in this world was initiated there, was built there, because it exists at a natural confluence of natural living abundance. Be that a high groundwater table, abundant springs, a river, great fertile soils, what have you. So if our communities exist because of that confluence of natural abundance, here's a question. Are our communities feeding that foundation of natural abundance, or are they degrading and depleting it? If they're degrading and depleting it, these communities won't be around in the future. So I see green infrastructure as one strategy that can give us a daily reminder of how we can live in a way that feeds what enables our communities to exist in those natural processes. So why green infrastructure? Well, everything I just said is a big why. Because we want to improve and inform the design of living urban infrastructure so that it contributes to larger interconnected living systems in a way that enhances the health and wealth of communities, their environments, and the larger watershed. So here we've got two scenarios. And I would say the one on the left is a mirage. And yet it is also an expression of extreme wealth. Okay? So when I say the image on the left is a mirage, you might be thinking, well, maybe you think oasis when you think of mirage, like you see this image of green in the distance. Well, there is green in this in the sense that it took a lot of money to bring in this concrete and create this infrastructure that gets rid of our most precious resource, the rain, as quickly as possible, and sets up the conditions where no life can naturally grow. Okay? So, thankfully, though, that's a depressing scenario. That's not thankful. But that's a depressing scenario. So thankfully, people have seen, well, we can shift that. And you guys will see this later in the tour, in the conference. But at the College of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, they saw the missed opportunity in this infrastructure. And they retrofitted it by jackhammering all the concrete, but leaving it in place. And it converted a impervious drainage way into a pervious infiltration way. So the water that used to flow out of the system now infiltrates between the broken up concrete, and that is now the free irrigation source for all this abundant vegetation. A true oasis. Because now that this has been established, it's not dependent on imported Colorado River water or groundwater to keep this vegetation thriving. It subsists only on the on-site rainwater and captured runoff. So another way we can shift from the mirage to the oasis is how we manage systems. So unfortunately, in the modern day, this is typical maintenance. Okay, I think it's maintaining a slow, cruel death. Okay, so and unfortunately, this image is not staged. This gentleman is literally vacuuming his yard. Okay, so he's vacuuming up the biomass, the leaf drop that is his future soil, is the material that enables the soil to act like a living sponge and absorb rather than repel that water, to hold on to rather than drain that water, and to build fertility. So whereas here, a different practice. So rather than exporting the biomass, we're pruning the tree as needed, cutting up the prunings, and putting them back under the tree in a water harvesting basin that captures street runoff via the street curb cut. And as there's more moisture here, there's a much faster rate of decomposition. So the organic matter that was placed here is more rapidly turned into soil. And a very spongy-like soil that much more readily absorbs the water. So we don't have puddles, we don't have mosquitoes, we don't have drowning issues. And we also find that all this biomass, along with the living plants, dramatically enhances the soil's ability to filter contaminants, which I'll cover in a moment. So here is a conversion of a drain to a true oasis within the urban environment here in Tucson. So here on a residential street corner, you had some weeds and you had bare dirt. That was about it. So we reversed the hill-like shape to a basin, cut the street curb to allow the street runoff into the basin. We added mulch that we pruned from the existing vegetation, put it in, and planted some food-bearing vegetation. So you can see the progression of years. We ended up with very productive prickly pear cactus, desert ironwood trees, and more. And here are some of the neighborhood kids harvesting and enjoying the bounty. And so this is an oasis on many levels. So not only is this abundant harvest irrigated only with on-site rainwater and street runoff, it's also building community and joy and dropping crime. So it's pretty tough to break into a car when you see kids having this much fun next to that car. Okay. So how do we encourage more of this green infrastructure, more generation of true oases in our living environments? Well, one of the handouts, which I don't know if you've received yet or you have received, I give a checklist of a number of things that we can do or consider to get a successful green infrastructure program going within our communities. And although they're in a numerical order, you don't have to follow that order. But one of the key things is for us to generate and share research and reputable data that can evolve our practices and policies. So Mitch Pavo Zuckerman, a researcher here at the University of Arizona, he's been doing some incredible research that's been validating and directing a lot of this green infrastructure work in Tucson. So first off, one of the things he's found is that the food-bearing trees are not uptaking heavy metals from the street runoff harvesting basins. So great news there. So it's looking good for producing perennial foods along our streets with street runoff. He's also found that trees associated with these organically mulched water harvesting basins grow 33% larger than trees without that mulched water harvesting basins. This more than doubles the tree's potential carbon sequestration and food production and shade production. And the presence of more organic matter in the soil enables the soil to sequester more carbon. Furthermore, it's found that when we have these basins mulched with organic matter as opposed to mulched with rock, the basins and the soil has 10 times the bioremediation ability of the rock mulched basins. So despite the fact that there's contaminants and whatnot coming off the street, if we create these living systems, they can do a great job of helping bioremediate those pollutants already in the system. And this is helping change practice, because I find throughout the Southwest there's a serious rock and gravel fetish, okay, where we seem to be pretty obsessed with the idea of blading out a lot of the vegetation that may exist in our landscapes and whatnot, and replacing it with rock to reduce water consumption. But this heats up our environment and can kind of lessen quality of life. So what I feel Mitch's research helps do is point out the value of organic matter and life beyond just the ornamental. And other research done in other states, for example in Colorado, is helping shift law, not just landscape practice. So perhaps some of you have heard that it's illegal to harvest rainwater in Colorado. Well, that's only partially true. It turns out it's always been legal to harvest rainwater in Colorado if you do it with these passive GI type strategies that capture the water and soil and vegetation. What has been illegal is storing rainwater collected off a roof in a tank. But that is now changing thanks to research. So Bjorn Courtney and other researchers in Colorado looked at undeveloped land, and they monitored how much water flows off of that land pre-development. And they found typically no more than 3%. And then they did computer modeling. What if historic flood flows came through? They found that no more than 15% of the rain would flow off the site. So that being the case, that shakes up the rationale upon which the laws were written, saying you can't harvest rainwater in a tank because you're harvesting water from people, you're stealing water from people downstream. So with this research, took it to the state legislature, they changed the law. Now it's legal to harvest rainwater in tanks, as long as you're not harvesting more than 85%. Okay? Now, there's more details in that. Not everyone can harvest rainwater in tanks yet. You have to be on your own private well or sewer, but things are going in the right direction. Okay, so another thing that we can do to further GI is to enhance the capability of our citizens and our professionals while getting on-the-ground examples. So this was a workshop done in La Paz, and this is pre-work, everyone coming out, cutting the street curb, digging the basins, and then once all the work was done, everyone's celebrating together for a great job, and oh shoot, it got cut out. Well, that's a water truck. You can only barely see it, but what I love, this seems to be a typical practice in Mexico, is to bring out the water truck after doing the work and see how everything works, create an artificial rainstorm. And it's awesome because then everyone's immediately seeing how well it works, or if aspects don't, how they can quickly adjust it and enhance it. Okay, and here's where everything starts going crazy. So the other great thing about this is once people have gone through this workshop, they have these skills and understanding that they didn't have before. Not only that, you now have an on-the-ground site that other people can come by and see. So this really starts to generate understanding and political will. And taking that further, we only have one of the four images here, but here at the University of Arizona, the students took this in another way. So a number of students here on campus wanted to learn about water harvesting and GI type strategies, but there was no course on this at the time. So they decided to circumvent the university's system for generating courses, and they got their own funding. So they didn't have to meet university guidelines on that. They got a Dr. Jim Riley, who will be presenting later today, who as a faculty member that would work with them, and they created a course after writing a grant that got their funding, and have created a water harvesting course here where they assess the campus, they design aspects of the campus that can be retrofitted to harvest rather than drain water, and then they implement them. So that's revolutionary. We're now shifting from just theoretical learning to actually practiced learning. Okay? And as they do this, they are helping transform the campus and understanding. And Dr. Jim Riley and the students went even further in that they got the students to be in advisory committees, such as the stormwater committee on campus. So the students were now stepping up and they had a say in the process. And when you have students at a university demanding that there be water harvesting and these types of strategies, it's really hard for the administration to ignore, because the university wouldn't exist without these students. And it turns out there were a number of people, policymakers and whatnot, that were and groundskeeping staff that wanted these changes to happen before the students stepped up. But the political will wasn't there. But once the students stepped up, that shifted things. And so it was amazing to go to a meeting with university staff and whatnot and hear that the groundskeeper staff admitting in front of their bosses and whatnot that they were doing guerrilla installations of green infrastructure throughout campus that was inspired and informed by the work that the students were doing. This is just one example of a system that you will see on the tour, but it went way further than this. Okay, so let's see, let me shift. Okay, so site assessment protocol is another great practice. Now, this is a map of Los Angeles, and Water LA and a whole number of nonprofits and government agencies are working together to assess what are the best and worst locations for water harvesting and green infrastructure. And so based on if it's darker or lighter, it's good or bad. So they look at a number of things like soil percolation and infiltration. So where you have really good infiltration, that's where you want to prioritize the work. Rather than going into the high clay, poor percolating soils where you're likely to have puddles, mosquitoes, and whatnot. Don't start there. Start where you're most likely to succeed. They also look at slopes, because in Los Angeles and much of Southern California, there's a real risk of mudslides. So they avoid the steeper mudslide-prone slopes, and they focus the efforts in the lower-lying, gradually sloping areas. They look at parkway width. So in the public right-of-way, is there enough space between property and street to have these strategies? Is there tree canopy? Do we need more? Volumes of water flow, climate vulnerability, and others. The Pima Association of Governments has a similar mapping program. Mead-Meyer will probably talk about some of this a bit later, but I'll just touch on a couple things. So this is my neighborhood here, and the darker areas, the bluer areas, are cooler areas where the orange and yellow are much hotter. So this is showing where we certainly need more life and shading and where we're doing a better job. This is another view of my neighborhood, and this mapping tool is able to show us that 43% of the neighborhood is rooftops and pavement, and almost another 20% is just bare earth. So really 60% of our neighborhood is paved, okay, is dead. Okay, but that dead stuff can generate life, because it does not absorb water. It sheds the water. So in the areas where we can get the water into the soil, we've got great potential to dramatically increase our available rainfall by concentrating the runoff from the paved areas to the absorption areas. Currently, our neighborhood, 12% is under tree canopy. That's not so good, but if you compare it to the county average, it's really good. It's almost double the county average. But it shows we can still do a lot more. But so often, the missing link is the water. Okay, so should we consume more water and increase our water bill? Well, no. By focusing on the on-site water, we can do great. Okay, so another way we can more connect with natural processes is by mapping out our watersheds and subwatersheds. So this is how it was proposed that by John Wesley Powell that the western United States be delineated, not by our mostly straight lines of today, but instead by our watershed boundaries. So this area all drains to a common river or waterway. Now, what if we had delineated the states this way, as opposed to the arbitrary political lines? I bet we'd all have a much better understanding of where our water comes from. And I bet we'd have fewer water disputes, because we would all in every state live within the natural boundary of our watershed and its resources. So this is a map of Tucson, broken up by the turquoise lines, by its high ridge lines, and the darker blue lines are the waterways. But here in yellow, that's my neighborhood. But here in pink is the total area that drains water to, through, and past my neighborhood. And so this type of mapping, I think, can start to enable us to see, wow, our neighborhoods are bigger than we think. Because if you look at the natural system, my neighborhood isn't just this, it's all of this. And what if I and all my neighbors, or most of my neighbors, did work in such a way that we created more true oases, not mirages, where we lived, in a way that enhanced not just our own private property site, but the whole subwatershed neighborhood as a whole. And if we did that, and then all these other neighborhood subwatersheds did, what would that do for the larger watershed? What would that do for our Santa Cruz River? Could it bring it back? What would it do for the larger Colorado River, of which whose watershed we are within? Okay, so great study done by Watershed Management Group with another great map that disappeared this morning. So, some of the great research that Watershed Management Group has been doing, along with Pima County, City of Tucson, is doing a lot of modeling in some of the subwatersheds here in Tucson, and found that by retrofitting existing neighborhoods with either 10% or 25% of the area of those neighborhoods with green infrastructure and some of the simple water harvesting, it can dramatically reduce flooding. Okay, so you can reduce peak flood flows by 40%. Okay, and other flows by 25% or more. And so, something about one thing I think that's key here is, as I just mentioned, the flooding is I find when there's a drought, as there is throughout much of the Southwest, particularly in California right now, there can be a lot of interest generated in water harvesting, better water management. But as soon as the first good rain comes, that interest will evaporate. Okay? So I think it's key that when we look at green infrastructure, we are always striving to create infrastructure that will buffer all extremes and work in all conditions. So how can we create green infrastructure that buffers drought, makes us more water resilient and water scarcity, but also dramatically reduces floods when we have that short spell of abundant water? And how can we then make our planting choices and all go even further still? So I think one key thing we need to do is to get better understanding of what plants are appropriate in what locations, and get this information in the plant nurseries and in all the gardeners and landscape designers' hands. So here are 3 rain garden zones. So if here's a basic water harvesting basin, there's 3 zones: the bottom, the terrace, and the top. And based on the plant's water needs and tolerance, you put it in the right zone. But most people don't have any clue as to what a plant's preferences are. And this is where I think we can make great strides in enhancing the so-called rain garden lists for all communities to list plant by its ideal rain garden zone. But then to take it further than that, because I find so often green infrastructure is focused on flood abatement or drought abatement, or bioremediating toxins. All this is great, but a lot of this, it's like, well, how do we lessen the bad? How do we enhance the great? Okay, how can we take that further? So can we also evolve our plant lists so that we are selecting plants to maximize the wildlife habitat? Okay? So there's more songbirds, there's more pollinators helping our garden. Can we choose plant species that are also enhancing the food production of the site, the shade production, the fragrance? So you pick certain blocks that you want to walk through because they smell so great, okay? And the easiest way to succeed with this is by using native vegetation. The vegetation indigenous to place that has co-evolved over millennia with the soils, the climate, and the wildlife. And so using this native vegetation, not only are we more likely to succeed, but this is also a great way to connect with what is unique to this place. Not just the wildlife and all of that, but also the cultures that have sustained and flourished here and have lived with these different plant species. Okay, all right, so the rest of it's just gone. Let me just sum up with the speaking. So, all right, one other thing that's in the handout, also talk about how it's good to foster market economic viability around the practice of green infrastructure with incentives. So one of the ways we can do that is by legalizing the practice. Okay, I mentioned how they did that, starting to do that in Colorado. Curb cuts used to be legal in Tucson, but are now legal. We can also do it with rebates. And one thing we're finding in Tucson, we've got a really great rebate program, but we aren't getting the results to the degree we want. So we're finding we haven't gotten as much water conservation as we would like with the water harvesting systems that are being rebated. That's not a problem. That's information to evolve the system. So now we're looking to rework the mandatory educational program that people have to go through to receive the rebate, and ensuring that we're really fronting that educational program with how do you create a water harvesting system that will reduce your water consumption, rather than just how do you put in a tank, okay? But what's the ultimate purpose of why we're doing this? Okay. And then there's stormwater utility fees, and I see there'll be a talk on that from the folks from El Paso. So, let's see. All right. Another thing that I think is key with green infrastructure is that we strive to continually evolve our irrigation practices. Now, I like to really push the envelope on this, in that the way I see green infrastructure is ideally it is set up to create these true oases. And if that's the case, then we should be designing, implementing, and maintaining these systems so that once established, they are irrigated only with on-site rainwater and runoff, okay? Not forever dependent on the drip irrigation system or whatnot. And Gary Whitworth, landscape architect with the City of Tucson Transportation Department, has been doing great work with this and finding that the city can put in these systems without a drip irrigation system and instead have a contract with a watering truck to get the vegetation established. Once it's established, the harvested rainwater takes over. He's also found ways to further enhance this, not only with mulch, but dry water put in at the time of planting to hold more of that application of water. So not only has this reduced the need and cost of an irrigation system and the problem with its leaks, needing to repair those, but he's also found some interesting info that this has reduced weed growth, because the weeds seem to be more opportunistic around regular watering, whereas the native vegetation is more opportunistic around the periodic pulses of storm water. Okay. Okay. So just last couple things is, I think one of the biggest challenges for green infrastructure at the moment is to evolve better maintenance regimes, understanding education and re-education. So we've had a lot of really successful GI installations in Tucson that overnight have disappeared due to a landscape company, crew, or individual going in and applying herbicide, or seeing abundant vegetation and wanting it cleared up, and then sometimes going as far as doing clear-cut removal of the vegetation. And a lot of that, I think, comes from the earlier slide I showed with the gentleman vacuuming his yard of rock. In a lot of ways, the dominant design paradigm and what's being promoted is more the sterile landscape. And if we are to bring more of this life, these living systems, into our public realm, we have to regain this understanding of living systems. The importance of the vegetation, what its role in the system is in getting the water beneath the surface and cooling the streets and filtering the toxins and whatnot. And the organic matter, the mulch, instead of just rake it and throw it away, how can we use that to further enhance the functioning of the system? And how can we do all of this in a way that also works for people's aesthetic and their outlook on beauty? So we are not there yet. We are evolving, but we're well on our way. And just to, well, I have more More checklists in the handout. You have the short version here. The long version will be available on the Beck website after the conference with links to the research that I discussed, a number of successful programs in different communities, development standards on how to do curb cuts, curb cores, and whatnot. So kind of a one-stop shop to see a lot of the successful programs elsewhere. But to wrap up the talk, oh, I'm doing better than I thought. Okay. Okay. To wrap up the talk, let's look forward. And where might we have the potential to utilize green infrastructure to not lessen the bad, but to maximize the good? And I think one of the places where we have some great potential is to really bring this much more into our public schools and along the routes to the schools. So to get the kids much more aware of this and enable the kids to bring it home with them into the family. And also in many of our planned housing developments, we have that have homeowners associations and whatnot. In such housing developments, you're not allowed to change the front yard. You have to keep it looking just as it does now. And unfortunately, these are typical mound-like landscapes that drain the water, the fertility and whatnot out of the system. So for forever, you have to maintain a dysfunctional system. So what if we shift the laws and the development standards? So in those settings, you have to have rain gardens. You have to have green infrastructure like landscapes. And perhaps one of the win-wins is the builder could get some stormwater harvesting credits by doing that. Sometimes the argument is made, well, you can't do that because the homeowner might get rid of the basin. But as the homeowners association, this third party is overseeing the maintenance and keeping these things as they are. I think that's a way to work with the system. And a number of programs, particularly in Southern California, are looking to have turf removal programs in people's yards and public rights-of-way, where they remove the grass to reduce the irrigation demand. And then they typically replace the grass with more drought-tolerant native vegetation. But I think that's missing the potential. So after removing the lawn, well, let's get incentives for then changing the topography. So it's not a hill, but it's more of a basin. So then when you replant with native vegetation, it can thrive just on the on-site rainwater. You don't need to bring in that water from elsewhere. And let's strive to always be ready for crises that we can transform into opportunity. So it's horrible what's going on in California at the moment. It'll probably be Arizona next year with the drought, and it'll probably be Sonora, Chihuahua the year after that. This is an opportunity for people to wake up. And I heard recently from Melanie Winter with Water LA that due to the crisis of the current drought, the Los Angeles mayor just helped the efforts of many entities in LA trying to bring green infrastructure into being there by including a request in his recent executive directive for recommendations on what changes will be required to local codes and ordinances to facilitate water harvesting. So even if your community's not ready yet or doesn't seem to be ready, do the work, get ready, because I guarantee it won't be long before you're presented with the perfect opportunity to offer some solutions. And lastly, I want to kind of come back to how I began. and ask the question, where would you like to live? In an oasis or in a mirage? And after you've made your pick, I want you to think about what currently is and what could be your role in the path you choose. Because I think we all have incredible capability to shift the direction of our communities through our own choice. And if we choose the path to an oasis, I very much believe that we can shift our whole community to the path to an oasis. And you'll see many examples throughout the conference of individuals, institutions, and others doing their part to make that shift. And thanks so much.